Today we're going to be talking about a very major issue for each and every one of us. In fact, it's probably one of the most defining factors that distinguish between an immature Christian and a very mature and grown-up Christian. And that is how you deal with temptation and how you deal with sin. But before we get into the text, let me just kind of give a little background to what I'm going to be speaking on. Today I'm going to be in James 1, 14 to 15. But I'm going to kind of start reading at 12 and 13 to give you a little bit of context here. And it says, "Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, for he himself tempts no one." So those verses are just kind of a good setup, a good foundation to what I'm going to be speaking on, and kind of a good foundation to my proposition, which is today we will look at 3 stages in the life of sin from James 1, 14 to 15. 3 stages in the life of sin. Now the first stage is that temptation begins. It says, but each person is tempted when...
Temptation begins, is that it?
Correct. And, excuse me, Dr. Fink, your mic is still on. I don't know.
Sorry about that. You go right ahead.
All right, thank you, sir.
I won't preach your sermon for you.
All right, thank you. It says that James is going to tell us when and how temptation begins. And the first thing is explaining the how. It says he is lured away and enticed. Now what James is using here is actually a fishing metaphor. Those words, lured away and enticed. And it's kind of like, it gives an idea of a deadly hook or a deadly trap that uses to trap an animal. Now I'm not really much of a fisherman myself, but I do kind of get the basic concept of it. Like you put bait on a hook and you throw it out in the water, you try to trick a fish into biting it, and then you slowly reel it back in. Well, see, that is what temptation does also to us. Because in this illustration, we're the fish, we're going around in our normal day, and we see something and we say, man, that looks good, I want that. And then we go and we take a bite of it without ever realizing that there's strings attached, without ever realizing that one bite can lead us into something worse. And it literally hooks onto us and pulls us away from God and into the devil's hands. This illustration kind of came to life to me on Monday night, actually. I was in a friend's car, I sat in the back seat, I sat down and I felt something kind of tugging on my shirt. And I looked down and it's actually a fishing hook got stuck on my sweater. And it wasn't just a normal one, it was the grappling one with the 3 hooks coming out. And no lie, I tried for the next 15 minutes in that car ride to get that hook undone. You know, I was trying to hide it from my friends. Eventually they saw it, they started laughing. It was very traumatic for me. But it wasn't until I got to our destination, I literally had to take off my shirt and give it to my friend where he could actually unhook it. But it wasn't until it left some scars, it left some rips in there. And see, many times when we face temptation, and especially a temptation that we struggle with very much, we can't overcome it by ourselves. We have to have help to get rid of that, and that help comes straight from God. Whether it's from prayer, whether it's from Bible reading and memorizing, that's what Jesus used when he was tempted, or even an accountability partner. So when he is lured away and enticed by his own desire. I want everybody to look really and just see who is doing this luring away and enticing. See, it's not the devil, it's not your girlfriend, it's not your family experience. It says by his own desire. The desire to be lured away and enticed comes from within you. It comes from within you. So you are lured away by your own desires. Now some of your translations might say lust or maybe evil desires. And that word, it can mean desire and it can also mean lust. I kind of like the word desire in this circumstance, though, just because that's what lust is in Bible terms. It's just a strong desire. 1 Timothy talks about how you can have a strong desire to become an elder, and it's a good thing, a lust after being an elder. And so this strong desire. So listen to me. This is kind of important because it says you can be lured away by your own desires. I believe that you can be lured away by good desires, too. Even, for instance, I can be so focused on being the best student I can, being the best Bible student that I can, that I put my personal walk on Christ behind me. Or I can be so concerned with lifting other people up in my ministry that I don't ever focus on my own ministry or ministering to myself. So the first stage is temptation begins. The next stage is that sin follows. Sin follows. And it says, then desire when it has conceived. What James is doing here is he's starting really a picture, an illustration in the text. And it starts at the very beginning of life, the conception, and it goes all the way to the end of life that we'll see in a minute. But see, whenever temptation, that temptation and your desire, whenever they meet up, whenever they get together, they literally conceive sin. That's what happens. And then the next thing after you conceive, obviously the next thing in the timeline of life is you give birth. And then normally, whenever a birth happens, it's usually a happy time. As I'm sure Tim knows, that it's usually just a happy and joyful time in everybody's life. But this time it's much different than that. This time that giving birth means that it's marking that sin has now come into play, that sin has happened. And it's finally become into sin. So the next phrase then, or the next stage, is death results. So temptation begins, sin follows, and death results. It says, and sin when it is fully grown. So after being born, after a little boy named Sin was conceived and then he was born, he grew up into a fully grown man. And see, it would have been much easier to take out sin, to get rid of this little small baby, to defeat a small little baby, than it is to defeat a fully grown man, because he's growing up, he's growing stronger. He has a much stronger grip on you than he ever did whenever the sin first started. So the more time you give to sin, the stronger and stronger it becomes. And to the final clause there, it says, brings forth death. And so finally, after living a full life of being conceived and given birth to, and then growing up, and finally this sin brings forth death. And it's not death of the sin, it's the death of you, whether spiritually or even physically. And did you notice how long of a time that there was between whenever it was first conceived to whenever sin first happened? That's, I mean, in our standard, it's 9 months. It doesn't necessarily mean that amount of time, but there was a long time there. And then there's also an even longer time between when sin happens and when death ends. So we have time and time and time again to defeat this sin in our lives, but yet the longer we let it go on, the stronger it's going to become until it reaches destruction. And to be honest, like this sermon really came to life in my life, because even when on Sunday night, when I was literally writing my sermon on temptation and sin, I unknowingly opened up a random Facebook message that I got. And I opened it up only to realize that it was a spam message with pornography in it. And at that moment, I had to make a choice of whether I was going to be lured away and enticed by some type of illustration, by some type of fake bait, or was I going to be able to flee from that? The Bible talks about fleeing from all forms of evil. And only by God's grace, by His power, I was able to delete that immediately and just go on without my day. So what now? Like, I don't really want to, in conclusion, I don't really want to just leave you with kind of this depressing thought of what sin does to your life, and you're ultimately going to die if you let sin happen. But really, what now? What can we take away from this? Well, look back to verse 12. I read that in the introduction. It's the context. Verse 12 says, "Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love Him." That word for trial in verse 12 is the same word that's temptation in the next verse. So what the Bible's saying here is that whenever we stand firm in this temptation, whenever we keep fighting this temptation, God's going to see that and He's going to bless us. And instead of receiving the death that sin brings, God is going to give us a crown of life. That's what God brings instead of what sin brings. So today my charge for you is this: to keep fighting, to keep going, to keep fleeing from sin. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Total time is 9:45. Thank you very much. So stand by.